On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we're going to discuss the endemic abuses within our halfway house system with civil rights attorney Stanley Cohen.
It is nothing about humanity. It's nothing about preparing people to go home. It's nothing about health, about training, about cleanliness. It's all about pillage and plunder. How much money can we make?
On Contact, neoliberalism is patriotism. Truth is not at the cat. Socialism, obedience, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. The prison system in the United States is a big business. Corporations make billions managing phone, food, and commissary services in prisons and halfway houses. They have privatized probation services. These for-profit halfway houses are closed worlds. They are notorious for arbitrary and punitive decisions. They frequently strip down staff, provide minimal or shoddy services, and overcharge states to make money. Those who live in these halfway houses, desperate to be released, rarely complain for fear of retribution, including the fear of being sent back to prison. Contracts to run halfway houses in many states are often a reward given by governors and legislators to political backers and campaign contributors. A 10-month study by the New York Times in 2012 of halfway houses found that drugs, gang activity, and violence, including sexual assaults, often go unchecked. Anya Parampil looks at the world of for-profit halfway houses that are located in most major cities.
We often hear about the private prison industry and their quest to cash in on mass incarceration. But what about private halfway houses? It turns out the facilities rake in massive amounts of profit for private companies like GEO Group, Corrections Corporation of America, and community education centers. Let's look at community education centers as just one example. It operates 31 facilities nationwide, with most located in Colorado, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In New Jersey alone, the New York Times reports the state spends $105 million on halfway houses. In 2011, $71 million of that went directly to community education. The facilities are branded as therapeutic, but at times investigation into them found them to be riddled with escapes, violence, gang activity, and drug use. The Times found in one facility, units housing 170 people were typically monitored by 1 or 2 low-wage workers. Not only that, but while New Jersey corrections officers usually have up to 15 weeks of training, community education counselors were found to have received only 8 days. And the lack of well-paid or trained employees has caused serious problems. Between 2005 and the first half of 2012, over 5,000 people escaped community education facilities. And in one facility, despite receiving millions of dollars in taxpayer funds for drug counseling, 73% of inmates tested positive during drug tests. Community education enjoys a cozy relationship with New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. His close friend and political advisor, William Palatucci, was a senior executive at the country until 2012. It's estimated 40% of the state's prison population passes through these private halfway houses. And while they're presented as an alternative to overcrowded and expensive prisons, they appear to be just another money-making appendage in the prison industrial complex.
Thank you, Anya. Now I'm joined by the radical lawyer Stanley Cohen. He filed a suit against Israel accusing it of war crimes and has represented Osama bin Laden's son-in-law. His clients have included squatters in New York, Occupy activists, and the Palestinian Islamic group Hamas, along with Hezbollah. Stanley was sent to a federal prison for 11 months and a halfway house for 10 weeks in the Bronx for failing to file timely tax returns from 2005 to 2010 and report some $35,000 in cash transactions. He and his supporters say with much justification that the sentence was political retribution.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
Well, let's talk about, and you wrote a very fine piece which is on your blog, Caged but Undaunted, The Road Home for Prisoner 1984-6052, about having just spent time in federal prison, but more importantly in that transition process of the halfway house system, which has become a huge business in the United States. Let's focus on that, because I think it is, when we hear talk of prison reform, it is really about new mechanisms by which corporations can make money off of people's bodies, and the halfway house system, which is privatized in many states. I live in New Jersey, one of the most egregious examples of a private system. Governor Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, was a lobbyist for community education services, which takes half of the state budget. Talk about your own experience. You were in the Bronx. You get out of prison. You go. What did you confront?
The most ill-equipped, dirtiest, repressive, ill-equipped, ill-trained, abusive, vile, money-grubbing institution imaginable.
Okay, paint a picture for me. So why do you say that?
It's across the street from a park where you can, when you go out to have your cigarette break, you can go and cop all the drugs you want, where there were 2 murders 6 months a year before. It's headed by an ex-WNBA basketball player, by GEO, which is the largest private.
Let's talk about GEO, because you write about GEO. So tell us about GEO.
GEO is the largest private prison enterprise in the United States and one of the largest in the world. It's a corporation. It gets $35,000 per person per body. It has roughly 90,000 people either in prisons that are run by it, or in halfway houses, or in some sort of custodial release. There are no social workers. There are no therapists. There's no psychiatrists. They're basically rundown shacks where the toilets don't work, the showers overflow, where you get violated for having the wrong telephone, where it's designed for you to get a job and to give them 40 or 50% of your income, where there's no support for the family, there's nothing to do, the food is horrible, the health situation is non-existent. It's designed to perpetuate recidivism, because in recidivism is the largest boon at the end of the day, because it means bigger sentences and more money for them and the government.
And as I mentioned to you before we went on air, Pennsylvania had just done a study about halfway houses and found that prisoners released to halfway houses had a higher rate of recidivism than prisoners released straight onto the street.
Yeah, look, I'm a big fan of community-based alternatives. 60% of everyone in federal prison, just dealing with them right now, has been convicted of a nonviolent offense or has no violent history whatsoever. They could just as easily be on home confinement. But no, people are dumped seriatim one after another into halfway houses, which makes billions of dollars for GEO. I was in a halfway house with people that would break the rules so that they would be picked up by the marshals to go back to prison.
Well, what was your day like in the halfway house?
Well, you see,
for the first 30 days, you're kind of quarantined.
No. See, I was special.
I see.
It's special because I had a good job. The minute I got there, the halfway house gets 50% of your income, so they wanted me out of there. So from the second day that I was there, I was already working. In essence, what I did was 4 nights a week, I slept 6 hours a night in a halfway house, and that was it. The rest of the time I was working, I was traveling around New York City, but on my off hours, the daytime, the night, showers, cooking, kitchens, you get to talk to people, you get to see people. Incredible depression. I didn't see anything like this.
Most of the people were not working, right?
No, most of the people are there to push mops, to rub showers down, because it's interesting. People that are working...
It's called neo-slavery.
Absolutely. 12 cents an hour when you're working in federal prison, and now GEO is getting $35,000 per body for someone who cleans a floor so that they can get 9 hours a week with their family.
Are they paid?
No.
So they're not paid at all?
They're not paid anything. The payment is the more you work and the harder you work and the more you suck up to someone who's not a social worker, not a therapist, not an employment counselor by any stretch of the imagination, you get 3 hours with your family. Right. What you learn is if you want to get out, go to the gym. If you want to get out, go to the church for 3 hours. But when it comes to reintegration, and I hate that word, when it comes to reuniting families, when it comes to working on developing you don't even have computers in the halfway house. You're not allowed to learn how to use computers. You're not allowed to learn how to use...
The whole idea behind a halfway house is that it transitions people back into normal society, giving them the skills, the counseling, along with the counseling, especially after they have had long prison sentences, so that they can reintegrate. Yeah. That's the idea.
Doesn't happen. You've got people, I was in a halfway house with folks that had done 20, 22, 23 years for nonviolent offenses, that when they got to the halfway house, they slept in a bunk 18 hours a day. Once in a while, there'd be a job fair. What's the job fair? It's someone from the government telling you about a non-existent job. You don't have a computer, you can't even fill out a job application. You can't use computers or aren't at the halfway house. Someone would get sick, 100 people would get down. You'd have to keep the windows open so that you could sleep at night because the boilers either didn't shut down or would shut down in the middle of the winter. The health, the filth, the despair. People running it, management people that were ill-trained, they didn't care, they worked bankers' hours. You asked a question, you got violated. You'd have hits, you'd have forms, you'd have threats all the time, take me out of here. Every Thursday morning, the U.S. Marshals would show up to pick 6, 7, 8 guys up who were thrilled to go to MDC or MCC to finish their sentences.
Now, you just explain what MCC or
well,
MDC
you've got the Metropolitan Correctional Centers, one in Brooklyn and one in Manhattan, which are federal maximum security facilities. But when you go there, you have gyms, you have doctors, you have family visits, you have libraries, you have access to computers, none of which you have in a halfway house.
And you can make, what, 22 cents an hour instead of nothing?
Well, I got 12 cents an hour, even on lockdowns when we get sent up as so much slave labor in the maximum security prison in Canaan.
One of the things I think a lot of people don't understand is that when we hear talk of prison reform, it is just another pernicious way corporations have decided to make money off of the imprisoned. Now, in New Jersey, with community education centers, they swallow $71 million, according to a New York Times investigation a couple years ago. Chris Christie used to be a lobbyist for community education services centers. He has passed this business, $71 million, out of an annual budget for halfway houses of $105 million. This has just become another way to bilk the government, to prey off of poor bodies, and to enrich a class of people that have found our carceral state to be very good business.
You know, it's interesting because the prisons are in rural America because it props up the economy of the Dust Bowl of the 21st century. Yeah, the halfway houses are in urban America where no one gets any skills training. People get dropped, returned, and are lost, which gets them back to rural American prisons.
Right. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with civil rights attorney Stanley Cohen.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome.
So
the only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch.
Wow.
Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Yeah, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
About your sudden passing, I've only just learned. You wore yourself thin, taking your last wrong turn. Your act got up to you as we all knew it would. I'd tell you I'm sorry, if only I could. So I write these last words in hopes to put to rest these things that I never got off my chest. I remember when we first met, my life turned on each breath. But then my feelings started to change. You talked about war like it was a game. Still, some were fond of you, those that didn't like to question or argue. And I secretly promised to never be like you. It's said one does not leave a funeral the same as one enters. The mind gets consumed with death, but this one quite differs. I speak to you now because there were no other takers. To proclaim that mainstream media has met its maker.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? What's your biggest fear in life? Ever been on a hayride? When's the last time you read a book? What would you say if you ever met the Pope? Who's the best quarterback of all time? What's one topping that doesn't belong on a pizza? Now, I've interviewed you too. Question more.
Earlier today, President Obama
Senate Republicans previously stated the component responsible for poisoning people in Flint.
There was always hope.
That's what goes
Trump
on
is
in
making a lot of noise
politics.
about
What are women
Mexican
supposed to do? Here's something else we know.
Between the U.S.
Lawyers
and
at the
Cuba.
ACLU have already some degree of loss in business.
It's a huge difference.
Following the announcement, oil prices.
Nobody's talking about this story because it's garbage.
Real, genuine, and significant change.
On contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to our conversation with civil rights attorney Stanley Cohen. Let's talk a little bit about GEO, the company that ran the halfway house you were in the Bronx. I think a lot of people don't understand how large a business this is.
GEO had gross revenues last year of, I think, $1.4 billion. The chief executive officer off of U.S. taxpayers earned, I think, $22 million or $24 million over a 3 or 4 year period a number of years ago. They employ tens of thousands of people. And what people don't understand about GEO as a private enterprise, the more it saves, the more profit it makes. Right. So it's not about an economic commitment for training, for programs, for cleanliness, for health.
Even though that's the raison d'etre of halfway houses.
That's exactly right. It is defined, it is designed to fail. The interesting thing with GEO is there have been programs all over the United States where they've been sued involving sex abuse, rape, murders, dangerous facilities.
Well, you list quite a long list of egregious activities on the part. Perhaps you can talk about a few of them.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's examples of a GEO facility that was run by the mayor of a small town who had a contract for the vending machine, who was getting kickbacks, who himself went to prison because he was taking 18-year-old women to motels on the weekend. We've got situations where people that were given jobs who had been convicted of violent offenses, who were running gangs, who were raping inmates. We've got cases where diseases took people's lives. We've got cases where kids were locked up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There have been lawsuits, there have been investigations, there have been prosecutions, but GEO continues to grow.
Well, because they have good lobbyists in Washington.
Great lobbyists that are getting campaign contributions. And keep in mind, the people that are debating privatization right now running for office in the United States are the same people that set this industry in motion coming out of 1993 and earlier.
Well, let's call Bill Clinton.
Well, Bill Clinton and also, Mr. Sanders, who voted for 1993, the Criminal Justice Act, which had a whole component which led directly into this privatization, ultimately because, okay, now we've got to get people back into the community. How do we do it? Halfway houses. Who to deal with it? GEO. Folks like that. More bang for the buck, less services for the people that are in need. These are people that have been, I was gone 11 months. I'm an attorney for 33 years.
This was 11 months in federal prison.
In a camp. All right. I go to a halfway house. I get a job. I'm lucky. Within 2 days, I'm out in the community. Halfway houses are filled with people that have been isolated for decades.
Yeah.
They don't know what it is to cut and paste. They don't know what Google is.
Right.
And they sit there without access to training, to programs, to family, to health care, or anything.
Well, that's why, I mean, a lot of people who examine the prison industrial complex argue, I think with much justification, that the system is designed to create high rates of recidivism. I think it's 67% nationally, because these people aren't going to make money unless they fill the beds. And as you write in your piece, The Road Home for Prisoner 1984, very good choice of numbers, Stanley, 1984 6052, these companies have found ways. I mean, I think what GEO is 95% full, almost 96% full occupancy.
There's a chart on the wall in the office when you walk in that has inmates, quote, and by the way, you go to a halfway house, why must we be called by our number? How about Mr. Cohen? How about Miss Jones? How about Mr. Smith? There's a chart on the wall.
You know why that is.
Oh, of course
Maybe you can tell us why.
Oh, because it's all about indoctrination. It's all about, in prisons, it's the snitch factor, and halfway houses, it's compliance.
And even when you got out, so you get out of the halfway house, and for a period of weeks, you're in home confinement?
Yeah.
And you were
6 weeks.
Right. And so at night, they're calling you every 2 hours, and what do you have to say into the phone?
check in, 1984
Yeah,
6052, hang up. It could have been my brother, it could have been the landlord, it could have been my mother for all they care.
You're not supposed to sleep.
No, you don't sleep. Come on, I'm not a kid. How about letting me sleep? I'm 100 miles from New York City. I don't have a car. I have a dog that's very sick. I'm isolated in the woods, and you've got to call me every 2 hours. Those are the rules. Sorry, those are the rules. That's what you constantly hear in the halfway house. The manager disappears for days on end. I had a very lovely case manager. 21-year-old woman, just got an undergraduate degree, first job. This is someone who's supposed to, the little red book, where do you still hate police? Do you hate the courts? Do you hate your family? And you start asking questions, what's hate? What's love?
But this is what they were asking you?
Oh, yes.
Based on what?
I mean, based upon this model that's created about what's necessary for reintegration.
No, but why were they asking you if you hate the police?
Well, because it's in this red book that every single person in a halfway house, no matter what you're there for, they assume you hate the police, you hate the government. You have to fill it out. So you have to identify.
Well, suppose you answer yes.
Well, then you don't get your pass. You don't get your furlough. Or if you debate with them. Perfect example. You have to pick a project for reintegration, quote unquote, what they call. Mine was how to make the perfect, every weekend, egg salad sandwich. Oh, I would learn how to boil an egg, and I would put this in a report. And oh, how I would know how to slice, I would season it. And oh, I would make the perfect toast. And oh, I'd make a sandwich, postscript.
This was your project?
Yes. How did it taste? Terrible. I hate it. I hate egg salad. I would sit there with a 22-year-old case manager, a lovely person who's asking me, and a great person, asking me the most ridiculous questions. Why? Because every single person is asked the same questions, no matter what your background, your age, your circumstances. And for those young women and men, and there were some women in the halfway house, that don't answer the questions correctly, the bells and whistles go off. So now you have a higher classification. So you get moved around. So you're not allowed to have a home visit. What's wrong with having your family being able to come to a facility to sit down and talk with you? As I wrote in my piece, you come to a crowded room, the kitchen, where there's 40 guys sitting around. That's your room. Someone's crying. There's a discussion going on, and someone watching a football game tells them to shut up. I mean, and no one cares. I mean, it's all about generating bucks for GEO.
One of the ways they generate money is by getting someone into the halfway house and then finding any excuse, however minor, to ship them out because, what do they get, about 34,000 or something?
Yes.
So you ship them out, there's an empty bed, you get another 34,000. So you're and we should talk about what these infractions are. You have coffee in your room. For instance, this is an actual case that I ran into teaching in prison. You have coffee in your room. They find the coffee. They call the corrections officers from the prison to come get you in the middle of the night and take you back to prison because you're not allowed to have coffee.
Or you have the wrong telephone. There's a certain phone that you can have, a certain phone you can't have. Or you can't hear the count time, so you're somewhere else. One of the things that some of the private halfway houses do in the United States is they sell beds. If you've got a job, if you're stable, you get out, you go to the halfway house, even though your home confinement hasn't kicked in yet, you get sent home. So you're still getting, you've got a now expanded home confinement, they're getting $35,000 a year for you, and then they turn around and fill the bed with someone else. So they're getting credit for 2 or 3 people in one bed, although there's only one person in the bed.
And when you were working, you have to give, what, 40% of...
They ended up taking almost 50% of my net salary. They demand 25% of your gross salary. They want you to pay the taxes on the revenue and then give them the money. So they get the money, tax paid already. They're already getting paid by the federal government.
Where does that money go? What's it?
It goes into the coffers. It goes into the $23 million a year over the 3-year period that the CEO got. It goes into junkets. It goes into investment portfolios. It goes into G4S, the parent company that's involved in Orlando right now. It is nothing about humanity. It's nothing about preparing people to go home. It's nothing about health, about training, about cleanliness. It's all about pillage and plunder. How much money can we make?
Talk about older prisoners, which you ran into. Now, you've got men or women that have been locked up decades.
Absolutely.
Talk about what happens to them.
Their families are gone.
Right.
They have no skills. They don't know how to cut and paste. They have no idea what Google is. They think it's a game like Scrabble. They sit there all day long. They can't get employed.
What do they do all day?
They just sit. Once in a while, they'll push a broom.
Well, aren't they forced to work in the halfway house?
Well, they're forced to work in the halfway house.
I mean, like cleaning.
Yeah, cleaning. Pushing a broom, cleaning a mirror, cleaning a toilet that's constantly flushing. But that's it.
Do they cook?
No.
Oh.
No. That's you know, the cooking is all pre-made.
In prison, they all have to work in the
That's
kitchens.
exactly right. I mean, I was the prison librarian at 12 cents an hour, except for when we did lockdowns at the maximum prison, I'd go up and bag lunches for the SHU.
The SHU, you have to tell people what a SHU is.
The special housing unit, which in the prison I was at is filled with 250 people 24/7, year in, year out. It goes on, completely isolated. Older prisoners, I had a friend of mine in prison, 74 years of age, an accountant. He got out, he went to a halfway house.
How long had he been in?
He was in a, quote, short time, 6 years for a white collar. Got out, went to a halfway house in New Jersey. He was disabled, so he couldn't get out and get a job. Punitive as hell they were with him.
This was in Newark, right?
This was in Newark.
Well, this was the charming community education centers.
They forced him to clean. They forced him to go up and down steps. When he couldn't get a job, they put him on the top floor. This went on. He eventually went out. He went home and he dropped dead 6 weeks later.
This is the Newark house. This is one of the 900-bed, one of the largest.
This is the Newark
in
house.
The country.
Keep in mind the Bronx house, the Southern District of New York, which the Bronx is in, is one of the largest judicial districts in the United States. There's one halfway house.
How many beds?
140 beds.
Right. I think what the other thing a lot of people don't realize is that these halfway houses are in essence prisons. I mean, you can have halfway houses with hundreds and hundreds of beds that function as prison. In some ways worse than prison because they would, although courtesy of Bill Clinton, again, we've stripped down a lot of our programs, including education, but in the halfway houses, I mean, it sometimes makes prison look like paradise.
I've got to tell you, the opportunities to get out, to get around, health-wise, work-wise, to be with people, to be treated with respect, was 10 times superior in the federal prison camp that I went to, and I know people at Lowe's and Medium that agree, than that halfway house. That terrible, depressing, filthy house of the dead that was written about in the 1880s still exists. And now it's privatized, and it's a huge business for the United States, and it's a huge business for lobbyists, and you've got tens of 80, 90,000 people that sit in these private hellholes while people debate. Almost all of them there for nonviolent offenses.
And when we talk about prison reform, this is what most people like the Koch brothers and others are talking about.
Yeah,
it's not reform.
No.
It's just another mutation of our system of neo-slavery.
That's exactly right. It's a new level of generating money for corporate enterprise in the United States. It also looks good statistically because GEO, you know, whenever the BOP would come in once every 4 months, all of a sudden they'd clean and look.
Great, Stanley. Thank you. That was civil rights attorney Stanley Cohen.
Thanks.
Prisoners in for-profit halfway houses and prisons work for free or for as little as 17 cents an hour. They do every job, from cooking and cleaning to cutting hair and shining the boots of the guards. As long as it is profitable to hold people in cages, the corporate state will have no incentive to carry out meaningful prison or judicial reform. And this is why prisoners across the country have called for a national work stoppage in prisons on September 9th, the anniversary of the 1971 Attica prison uprising. They promise to internally cripple a mass incarceration system that cannot function without grossly underpaid or unpaid prison labor. There is, these prisoners say, no other option left. The prison communique reads, "We will not only demand the end of prison slavery, we will end it ourselves by ceasing to be slaves." Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.